This week, on DeadPhilSunday, we'll be taking a look at the difficulties faced by Commonwealth veterans, specifically Fijian ones, when they tried to regularise their immigration status after discharge from the UK military. This forms part of a wider and ongoing conversation about the UK's immigration system, particularly its fairness for those who want to settle here. We will, however, focus on The Guardian's reporting of the tribulations faced by one Fijian veteran, Taitusi Ratucaucau. From this, we will turn to Wendy Brown's book chapter, Tolerance as a Discourse of Power, and discuss how this secular, multicultural, liberal, tolerant image of the UK might form part of a wider exercise of power on its part, concluding with an analysis of the contradiction between the treatment of Fijian veterans and a supposedly tolerant UK. The Guardian has reported the bureaucratic plight this Fijian soldier faced after randomly being discharged. Here I quote at length. 2 decades ago, when Taitusi Ratucaucau signed his papers, there was such hope. A career in the British Army would bring security, adventure, a sense too of service. In 2000, his homeland Fiji, roiled by a protracted and violent coup, held little hope. A career in the British military was Ratucaucau's ticket to a wider world. He would serve for 11 years, earning medals on tours of Iraq and Afghanistan. But out of uniform, Ratucaucau says he has been abandoned by the UK government, left damaged, bitter and broke, and facing deportation from the country he served. End quote. The abruptness of his discharge came in 2011, when he was given just 28 days' notice that the 22-year contract he'd signed with the British Army would be terminated, despite it still having 11 years left to run. End quote. The Guardian reports that his life quite rapidly deteriorated, as after being discharged, Ratucaucau was asked to leave his married quarters and lived for a time in a car park in Abingdon. He took work on the railways, paying tax and national insurance, but then, unable to regularise his immigration status, he was prevented from working. Ratucaucau had spent his savings to bring his wife and 3 daughters to the UK, but could not yet afford to apply for permanent residency, at a cost of £5,000 per application. End quote. He would later be diagnosed with a brain tumour, which would see him billed £27,000 by the NHS, given that he was treated as an overseas patient. Thankfully, however, a crowdfunding campaign cleared his medical bill, but the 49-year-old veteran's future in the UK remains uncertain. End quote. Turning now to Wendy Brown and her writings on tolerance. For many, tolerance connotes positivity. It is, according to the Cambridge English Dictionary, defined as a willingness to accept behaviour and beliefs that are different from your own, although you might not agree with or approve of them. End quote. This would, for many in the UK and other Western liberal democracies, therefore, be a concept with which they are familiar, as tolerance forms the cornerstone of this secular, multicultural, liberal nation-state of which they are members of. Many would count themselves as not being homophobic, or racist, or sexist. Many would say that they were welcoming and upheld the rights of others. Many would also say they advocated for the total equality of all persons. This seems like an overwhelmingly positive concept, so why might Brown pose it as being something more insidious? Firstly, she focuses particularly on what the implications of the definition of tolerance are, noting that tolerance anoints the bearer with virtue, with standing for a principled act of permitting one's principles to be affronted. End quote. Meaning that tolerance is actually one's willingness to bear difference. From this she goes further, arguing that in every lexicon, tolerance signifies the limits on what foreign, erroneous, objectionable, or dangerous element can be allowed to cohabit with the host, without destroying the host. End quote. Tolerance is dealing with the other. It appears then as a mode of incorporating and regulating the presence of the threatening other within. End quote. She notes that only recently has tolerance become an emblem of Western civilization, an emblem that identifies the West exclusively with modernity, and with liberal democracy in particular, whilst also disavowing the West's savagely intolerant history. End quote. The definition of tolerance, then, has rapidly, recently, and fundamentally changed. I'd wager that few would consider themselves tolerant if they accounted for this concept being a way of managing, dominating, eradicating difference. Brown's conception of tolerance breaks down the way in which it is popularly defined, noting that tolerance is not equivalent to equality." End quote. Building from Brown, we can clearly see that the UK's treatment of Commonwealth veterans like Ratucaucau stands in conflict with a popular definition of tolerance, but aligns easily with Brown's more polemic definition. I argue that this treatment of Commonwealth veterans is precisely the reality of tolerance. The reality of it is the antonym of its popular definition. To quote Brown again, tolerance thus becomes a critical term in the legitimation of Western empire in the 21st century. End quote. So we call upon the colonised subjects, the people formerly under British dominion, to come and fight for a queen and country, not theirs naturally, but a royally imposed one. This is an act of tolerance, because the UK is seemingly incorporating difference into their military, weaponising it, using it to fight difference in the lands of another other. The subject Western powers use to colonise to civilise is precisely the one that is used to bear the standard of the neo-colonial civilising mission today. The difference of the Fijian soldier is tolerated only temporarily. Their abject otherness can only be borne for a limited amount of time, before the other apparatuses of the state turn around and turf them out. They then become the unhelpful other, the vilified other, the intolerable other, straining British resources and taking up space that was apparently never theirs. Sounds all rather familiar, doesn't it? Coming into a space that isn't yours, taking up the resources and existing as a subject of total difference. After turfing them out, to quote Mark Fisher, all that is solid melts into PR, end quote. We commemorate and thank those foreigners that protected this green and pleasant land while simultaneously throwing them to the wolves. How very tolerant of us. This marks the end of the 12th episode of DeadPhilSundays. We hope you enjoyed it, and that we'll see you again next week.